In this tutorial, we're going to create this parallax animation inside of After Effects using the New York City skyline. We'll begin by importing the PSD that was provided. Going to File, Import, File, or Command-I. I'll select the PSD, and at the bottom of the import window, I'm going to choose Composition Retain Layer Size and hit Open and OK. I'll double click on it to open it up in a composition window. I've set my composition timeline to 20 seconds, and I'll have each of these clips go the distance. Putting my playback head at the end of the timeline, I'll shift select all of the files in the timeline. Holding down the option, I'll hit the close bracket. Next, I want to convert these to 3D files. And I'll do that by going down to where the little cube appears here. And with them all selected, if I was to click one of them, they will all be selected as well. Next, we'll introduce the camera that will give us the parallax 3D view. Going up to Layer at the top of the user interface, New, and then Camera. I'll leave the defaults and click OK. And I'll make that the full length of the timeline as well. Now we'll begin by turning off all the layers with the exception of the layer of the sky. And with it selected, I'm going to hit P for position. And in the position, I'm going to be dragging on the last set of numbers here. And as I drag them to the right, it starts to push the image back further in space on the Z-axis, which will give us that 3D parallax effect. I'll start to center it a little bit better, and I'll make it 2000, and then I'll scale it to fit. So we always change the position first, and then we scale it to fit the camera view. Next, I'll turn on the Empire State Building, and I'll hit P on the keyboard for it, and I'm going to select the 2 zeros here, and I'll put in 1500, and I'll scale that to fit on my screen. Hitting S on the keyboard, and I'll make that fit across like that. And I'll open up the Freedom Tower, and we'll set the position for that, again, with the last 2 zeros in this 3 number sequence, X, Y, Z, so Z would be 1000. And then I'll scale it to fit the screen as well, and I think I'll move it down a little bit so I see more of the New York skyline here. So once we introduce our camera and animate the actual camera position to zoom in, we can go back and adjust these images. Next, we'll open up the Citicorp, turning it on, and position will be for the Citicorp building, 500. And I'll move it down, and I'll scale it to fit a little bit smaller on screen. And then I'm going to put on the Statue of Liberty. I'll make the position for the Statue of Liberty 200, and then I'll scale it to fit on screen. And I'm kind of interested in the harbor here as the border at the bottom that leads us into the city. So we're going from Liberty Harbor into the city itself, kind of. So I'm going to go ahead and scale that to fit down there. And again, I can always come back and tweak these to get the effect I want, but this is where we're going to start with this. Lastly, we'll put the jet on screen. And again, I'll hit P for position. I'll make this 100, and then I'll scale it quite a bit. Now we're going to go and play with the camera itself. So the camera is the pinkish layer. I'll collapse all my other layers by selecting them and hitting T on the keyboard a couple of times. Now we'll animate the jet and the camera itself. I'll start by selecting the jet, hitting S for scale. I'm dropping the scale to 20%. And then I'll hit P for position. And I'm making the position in the Z-axis 225. Now I'll drag the jet off the right-hand side of my comp window. And at frame 1, I'll set the first keyframe for position. Going to second number 10, I'll drag it off the other side of the comp window. And I have it so the jet goes between the Statue of Liberty and the buildings. All of this is pretty subjective once we start to animate the camera. So I'll go ahead and I'll collapse the jet file, open up the camera by going to frame 1. And with the layer selected, I'll hit P for position, dropping the first keyframe. I'll proceed to second number 10, and I'll start to zoom in on the Statue of Liberty by dragging on the Z-axis with my left mouse to the right. And again, this is very subjective where you decide how close you want this to kind of zoom in. And at this point, you might find yourself, once you've established the distance you want, and I'm doing this so that a little bit of the statue goes off the top and the bottom, and just those basic design components where if imagery appears off the sides, bottom and top of a given composition window, it would kind of imply the scene is much larger than what we're seeing. Now I could return to my camera position and I can start to alter the other two vertexes, which are the X. So if I go back and forth on the X, the first set of numbers, you can see I can rotate the view of the number and how I want it to zoom in and finally come to rest. And now I'm going to export that 10-second video. I'll go to Composition, Add to Render Queue, or Command-Control-M, and I'll generate that video. And once we've done that, we'll come back in and we'll put the text on the end of it as well. I've imported the composition we just rendered, and I'm going to put it in its own timeline. Selecting it, I'll click and drag it over the new comp icon at the bottom of the project window, red, green, blue film strip. It sets it for 10 seconds, but we're going to need at least 15 seconds. So we'll go to Composition, Composition Settings, and we'll set the duration for 20 seconds. And we'll make the background white. With the timeline selected, I'll hit minus on the keyboard to reveal the rest of the time we've just added. I'm going to select the clip in the timeline, right-click, and hold my mouse down, and I'll go to Time and choose Enable Time Remapping. You'll see two keyframes now at the bottom of the clip, and that's going to allow us to put static time on either end of the clip. Now, at the beginning, we want 1 second of static time. So in my timeline, I'll punch in 100, and I'll move the clip to that point. And if I were to drag on the clip to the left now, to the beginning of the timeline, I've got a static frame until we hit second number 1. Let's go to the out point now, and let's add another 4 seconds to whatever number you see in the corner. For me, it'll be 1500, and I'll extend the clip out to that point as well. So now we've got static on the other end. Now the next thing we want to do is put a fade in, fade out, and that will give us the white background we're looking for, so when we integrate it into the Whitney layout, it'll blend in. With my playback head back at the beginning, I'll hit T for transparency, drop the first keyframe, and zero out the opacity. I'll go to second number 1, and I'll return it to 100%. Now I'll go to second 11, and at second 11, I'll copy and paste the keyframe from the previous, and then I'll go to the end of the clip, and I'll make the opacity 0 again. If I hit N on the keyboard, I can define the work area. I'll give it a preview. And next we'll introduce the text. We're going to introduce the text, but we'll do it by making its own composition first. So I've created a new composition the same size as the video, and I'll click on my text tool, and I'm going to hit the cap lock, and I'll type anywhere in the document window, and this will be Cityscapes. And I'll select all the fonts by hitting Command A, and then over on the text editing window, I'll change the font size to 50. I'm using Helvetica or Arial, and I'm going to make it bold. And I'll deselect it. And I'm just going to get my Move tool now, and I'll just kind of put it up here on the left-hand corner. We need another one which will give us a date, so I'll hit Command D with it selected in the timeline. And if you get this red bar below, just hit your cap lock and take it off, and you'll be able to see your text. And down over in this area, I'll select the text once again. I'll change it from bold to regular, and I'll type in with my cap lock on. And I'll click on my Move tool to get out of that. So this is going to be over on this side of our document when it comes to rest, and then Cityscapes will be over here. Now we'll introduce a vertical black line to separate these two text elements. I'll hit G on the keyboard, and making sure that none of my files are selected in the timeline, that means I can draw a Bezier curve. So with the pen tool selected, if I were to go to the top of the user interface, I've clicked on the word fill, and I've made sure that in the pop-up option window that I've blocked it out. I'll now go to the stroke, and I'm going to set the stroke size for 4 and the color for black. So if I was to click here, I get the color picker here, and I can choose black from that if need be. I'll start by clicking up about here. Holding the shift, I'll drag down to about the same distance from the bottom, and I'll click. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to scale this so that it appears to be generating from the middle and going to the top and the bottom. So I'm going to go to the attributes in the timeline, and we're going to be changing the scale. And for scale, I'm setting the first keyframe at the beginning of the timeline, and I'll unlock that function. What we can do now is, with either of these, we can scale them independently. We'll be scaling the y-axis, the one over here. And it's going to be a 1 second function. So let's go into time, and we'll put 1 second for our timeline. And once we've unlocked it, we'll set the y-axis to 0. And the line will disappear. Now I'm going to go 1 second in time, and I'll make it 100% again. Now we've got this line that's going to animate for us over that 1 second duration. Now we want the text to start appearing. So at 1 second, I'm going to line the text up. Now we're not going to see these text elements until after the line appears. So that means we'll have to go to our timeline. And I'm simply going to shift select the 2 text elements, and I'll move them to the 1 second point. So if I was to drag previous to that, you can see we don't have our text showing. The text will come on in 1 second as well. So that means we want to put our first keyframes for the text at 2 seconds. So with both of them selected, I'll choose P for position and drop a keyframe. It will do both of them at the same time. So at this point, I want to see the date on the right-hand side when the animation is completed, and I want to see cityscapes on the left-hand side. Now I'm going to go back to the beginning of those 2 text layers. I can hit I on the keyboard, or I can shift snap. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set keyframes for both of them, but they're going to be different, right? So I'm going to click on the date. I'll click on it and I'll drag it over to the other side of the line. And now I'll go to cityscape, and I'll drag it over to the other side. If I was to go back to the beginning of my timeline and drag through, I get my line, and then I'll get this. Now I don't want to see these text elements until they appear on opposite sides of the black line. So I'll put the playback head at the beginning of the date. And with the layer selected, I'm going to go to Layer Pre-Compose Layer, making sure that Move All Attributes is checked off. I'll click OK. Now if I was to drag through the 2 second duration to where I see the date on the right-hand side where I want it to be, I can now hit Q or go up to the top of the user interface and get the little box here. And that's going to allow me, if that brown layer is selected, the pre-composed layer is selected, I can now click and drag a mask around it, which means now if I was to play through, I'm not going to see that until it appears on the right-hand side. We'll do the same to the cityscapes. So with it selected, I'll go up to Layer Pre-Compose Layer, and I'll click OK. Dragging through to make sure cityscapes is on the left-hand side and has come to rest. Once again, I'll hit Q, and I'll drag the mask around it. And if I was to click and drag through now, I have this. And I'll go ahead and I'll save. Now that we have the text prepared, I've turned off the background, we're going to introduce it into our regular composition. With the text placed in the composition where we've got the additional time at the beginning and the end, I want to place the beginning of the text layer at 11 seconds. So I'll put in 11 seconds in my timeline, and then I'll move the beginning of that comp to that point. So now if I was to drag through, I will see something like this. And all we have to do now is import this into the composition with the banner and the layout. I'll go ahead and I'll export this as an H.264 and proceed to that point.